On April 18, 1912, George and Irene Douglas of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, stood on a pier in West Manhattan. They were waiting in a heavy evening rain with thousands of others for the arrival of the RMS Carpathia, bearing passengers rescued from the Titanic. Over 1,500 people had perished, but nearly 4 days after the disaster, George and Irene still didn't know if their loved ones had survived. Hello, I'm David Jansen, and today I'm speaking to you from Brucemore, a museum property of the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. If you enjoy exploring the nooks and crannies of history, please subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss another episode. By 1911, George and Irene Douglas were living the American dream. George's father, a Scottish immigrant, had settled in Cedar Rapids and started what became the Quaker Oats Company. George and his brother Walter learned from their father and eventually set off on their own, organizing companies to sell linseed oil and cornstarch, ultimately launching their crowning achievement together, the Douglas Starch Works. With a railroad expansion after the Civil War and a surge of immigration and migration to the Midwest, there was an agribusiness boom in eastern Iowa at the end of the 19th century. The Douglas family were part of that growth. As their company thrived, George and Walter amassed fortunes. The brothers became popular business and cultural leaders in the region. They were early advocates of public art and community theater, even acting in local plays. And as first-generation Scottish Americans, the Douglas brothers introduced golf to Cedar Rapids in the early 1900s. George and Irene and their 3 daughters lived on a 33-acre estate on the edge of Cedar Rapids, which they called Brucemore, in reference to George and Walter's ancestral connections to Scottish King Robert the Bruce. I'm speaking to you today from Brucemore's Great Hall in front of a portrait of young George. Meanwhile, Walter expanded his business ventures to Minnesota. A widower in his late 40s, Walter married Mahala Dutton, a spirited, fashionable Cedar Rapids socialite, in 1906. They built their version of Brucemore near Lake Minnetonka, an estate they called Walden. 1912 promised to be another great year for the Douglas brothers. After celebrating the holidays in Cedar Rapids at the end of 1911, Walter and his wife Mahala departed for a 3-month tour of Europe to celebrate Walter's 50th birthday, his retirement, and a shop for furniture for their Minneapolis estate. For their triumphant return, Walter booked them first-class passage back to New York. And so on April 10th, 1912, in Cherbourg, France, Walter and Mahala, along with their maid Berthe de Roy, boarded the RMS Titanic. The Titanic sank in the pre-dawn hours of April 15th, 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The limited wireless communication and the remoteness of the site led to a wave of misinformation. As word of the accident reached Cedar Rapids the next day, the magnitude of the disaster wasn't clear. Irene Douglas's journal entry the night after the sinking reflects this confusion.
The news of Titanic's disaster came at noon while we were at luncheon. Did not seem serious until evening, about 7:30. Spent the evening at the newspaper office.
The Cedar Rapids community flooded the Douglas household with messages of concern. Irene reported the next day that the morning was spent frantically answering telephones and telegrams. News outlets across the country and around the world struggled to piece together what had happened, but local press in Iowa focused on the Douglases. Some reported or guessed that both Mahala and Walter were safe. Others admitted they didn't have enough information. After 2 agonizing days of conjecture and, in Irene's words, hearing no news from Walter, George and Irene decided to leave for New York to meet the survivors when they landed. George and Irene left Cedar Rapids on Tuesday afternoon, April 16th, spent the night in Chicago, and departed for New York around noon on Wednesday the 17th. Back home that day, the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette reported,
No definite news had been received in Cedar Rapids concerning the fate of Mr. Walter D. Douglas. The wireless telegraph companies having great trouble in effecting communication with the Carpathia, it appears that a considerable number of the first and second cabin passengers, especially the men, must have perished, but it is still hoped that Mr. Douglas was among the ones rescued. Mrs. Douglas is on the Carpathia, but whether Mr. Douglas went down with the boat, as did many others of the male passengers, remains to be determined.
After a 20-hour train ride from Chicago, George and Irene arrived in New York on Thursday the 18th at 9 o'clock a.m. The Carpathia was scheduled to land that evening. And so it came to pass that on a rainy, gloomy night in Manhattan, George and Irene Douglas joined a crowd of thousands at Pier 54 in an agonizing climate of hope and dread, as the ship bearing 713 survivors slowly approached. Whatever anticipation or emotions George and Irene felt after 4 days of uncertainty must have been overwhelming in that moment, with nothing to do but wait. Before docking, the Carpathia paused to disembark third-class passengers onto tenders to shuttle them to Ellis Island, and then delivered the Titanic's empty lifeboats to the White Star Line's pier nearby. Finally, the Cunard liner docked, set ramps, and the rest of the traumatized, stoic survivors disembarked, approaching the crowded pier. George and Irene strained to see familiar faces. Irene's 2-sentence journal entry later that night posted the answer to the question that the family and their entire community had been asking.
Carpathia landed 7 in the eve. Walter not with Mahala.
In the formal inquiries into the disaster, Mahala shared what she knew of Walter's final moments.
I did not want to leave my husband. When they insisted, I said, "Walter, you must come with me." "I can't," he said. "I must be a man." Then he bade me goodbye and said he hoped he would soon be with me again. When I last saw him, he was turning to assist several women and children who were waiting to get into lifeboats. I was told afterwards that he assisted in lowering the last boatload of women into the sea.
Walter Douglas perished in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic on April 15th, 1912. Not knowing if any remains would be reclaimed only added to the anguish of families like the Douglases. Over a week after the disaster, the McKay Bennett, a ship on a search and recovery mission, retrieved Walter's body. He was found with his gold monogrammed cigarette case, $551 in cash, still wearing his engraved wedding ring. He was entombed in Cedar Rapids on May 5th, 1912, with hundreds of local citizens at the cemetery paying their respects. With her maid, Berthe Leroy, Mahala Douglas survived the disaster. She went on to live a long, remarkable life at Walden. The decade after losing his brother was hard on George Douglas. 6 years after the Titanic disaster, the Douglas Starch Works, the company George had built with Walter, exploded in the worst industrial accident in the city's history. 43 employees died. And while multiple investigations found the company followed all contemporary safety standards, the death toll and the collapse of the business were too much to bear. George poured the family fortune into the company to keep it operating until he could find a buyer, and then he retired. But his youngest daughter, Barbara, who was only 3 years old when her uncle Walter perished, remembered Brucemore as a dark and a sad place growing up. In his final years, George's health declined. He died in 1923 at 65 years old and was entombed in the family crypt where he had laid his brother to rest 9 years earlier. Irene lived a fascinating and productive life at Brucemore, remaining an active social community leader in Cedar Rapids over the next decade until her death in 1937. When we experience great tragedies that include the loss of lives, it's sometimes easier to focus on the coldness of numbers, thinking about the cost of the damage or how many people died rather than on the human implications insulates us a little from the suffering. With historic disasters, the passage of time can also dampen our empathy. But stories like that of the Douglas family remind us that fundamentally history is about people who are very similar to us in all of the important ways. And whether it happened a century ago or a day ago, the loss of just one person impacts the lives of so many others, creating a ripple effect that touches countless people and sometimes changes history. To hear more about Mahala Douglas's own remarkable story and other interesting people and events, check out more episodes on this channel. Thank you for watching.